Randall. Osborne warns the banks, stick to the new ring fence rules or be broken up. Tax crackdown, the head of the HMRC's business unit on catching the dodgers. Bridging the Gulf, the boss of Abu Dhabi's Etihad Airways on tripling its annual profits. Betting rings smashed. Hundreds of football games, including one in Britain, get fixed. Well, the Chancellor today warned Britain's biggest banks comply with new rules to separate so-called casino operations from retail accounts or be broken up. In a speech to bankers, George Osborne said that new regulations would reset the financial industry after years of failing customers. Sky's business correspondent Ursula Errington reports.
Where bank accounts are concerned, it would seem we just can't face the upheaval of switching banks to keep them on their toes. And we're resigned to the fact that some bureaucracy is inevitable when processing transfers and clearing cheques. But the Chancellor isn't. With 75% of accounts held by just 4 banks, he wants to pep up the performance of retail banks by encouraging a bit more competition.
The banking system isn't working for its customers, so we will change it. And I can announce today that the government will bring forward detailed proposals to open up the payment system. From September this year, every customer of every bank in Britain will be able to switch their bank account from their existing bank to another one in just 7 days. All they'll have to do is sign up to a new bank and the rest will follow.
Bearing in mind many people have been with the same bank all their lives, will we suddenly see an improvement in service?
I think we will still see with mortgages, we will still see the banks asking for higher deposits, we will still see with credit cards them vetting very carefully before they offer you the 0% deals. So I don't think it's suddenly going to make things easier. What it could do is maybe increase consumer confidence because they will think, hang on, the bank is going to hopefully have a separate issue with consumer banking and the investment side.
The Chancellor also wants to make it easier for new banks to reach out for our business. And the idea behind all the measures in the banking reform bill is to empower consumers through choice. But the bill also deals with something more fundamental. It imposes structural obligations on the banks so we never have to bail them out again.
Ring fencing is supposed to protect core high street banking activities, even if the investment arm of a bank fails. The Chancellor says the two parts of a bank must have different bosses. The high street bank will manage its own risk, and the investment bank can't use customers' savings for its activities. But as the US has shown, banks can find ways around those rules. So the Chancellor is electrifying the fence. If a bank misbehaves, the regulator and the Treasury can break it up, forcing full separation. Unsurprisingly, the bankers don't appreciate the Chancellor's threat.
This reform today is one too far. It's clearly good politics, but it's actually very bad economics. And it's bad economics because it's yet another measure that makes it more difficult for the banks to raise money to lend to small businesses and get the economy growing again.
But in real terms, total separation would only happen in extreme circumstances, and in the Chancellor's own words, good banks would have nothing to fear. Ursula Errington, Sky News, Central London.
Well, our chief political correspondent John Craig joins us live now from Westminster. Evening, John. Is the Chancellor simply reiterating what we already knew, or is there a new step change here in regulation?
Well, according to the Labour Party, of course, Mr Balls, Ed Balls, says he's not going far enough. Now, as we know, these proposals follow the Vickers report on banking. They follow all the billions of pounds of taxpayers' money piled in. One thing we didn't hear much about today, although Greg Clark, the Treasury Minister, was hauled before MPs, was privatising those state-owned banks. And one of the things that Vince Cable's quite keen to do also is to have a share sale, if you like, of shares in some of these banks that are going to be sold off between now and the next election. So government's keeping that one up its sleeve.
What about Ed Balls? I thought he famously believed in light touch regulation. Has he had a Damascene conversion?
Well, during the exchanges in the House this afternoon, Greg Clark was talking about the botched regulation of the Labour government, of course, of which Ed Balls was a prominent member, first of all as a Brown advisor and then a minister. He was city minister at one stage. What Labour are talking about today is beefing up this legislation when it goes through Parliament. Now, what Mr Osborne and Greg Clark have unveiled today, the Financial Services Banking Reform Bill, well, that'll get its second reading in the Commons quite soon. Then, of course, it will go through committee, and there will be various moves by the opposition and no doubt others to try and beef it up. We heard from Tories like John Redwood today calling for the privatisation of these banks. Mind you, we also heard from some left-wing Labour MPs who'd like to see the banks nationalised. I remember when they were taken into public ownership a year or two ago, there were cheers on the Labour benches. Well, privatisation is what's coming, not nationalisation, because the government wants to get rid of some of those huge costs to the taxpayer. At the same time, make a better deal for customers as well, because the government, this is all part of the government wanting to get the economy growing, and of course every MP will tell you is the banks have been frustrating small businesses in particular by their refusal to borrow. So the government wants to try and improve services also. Mr Osborne was talking today about, first of all, changing your bank within 7 days, and secondly, speeding up the clearing of cheques. Well, that's not actually in the legislation, but those are the sort of measures that I think most people would welcome.
John Craig, many thanks. Well, I'm joined now from our central London studio by independent banking analyst Chris Skinner. Evening, Chris. Nice to see you. Many thanks for joining us. The banks warn that these new rules will damage shareholder value. Will they?
Well, I think the concern right now is exactly where is all this going, because the UK is doing a number of reforms that Europe hasn't yet bought into. Europe may have other reforms that would also affect London, and equally globally there's other rules like Basel III which affect the banks as well. So it's trying to get all these rules to work together. But the one thing that's really came out of George Osborne's speech today is there's 4 principles in the UK, which is better regulation, better regulators, better choice, and better people running the banks.
Let me just take you back to my original question. If indeed Osborne's intention, and he could put this into practice, is to make the banks less risky, why would that damage shareholder value? Surely it would enhance it.
Well, it's because the banks will not be competitive in the European and global framework because they're operating to different rules. And in particular, under the ring fencing rules, each of the bank's subsidiaries will have to have their own capital holdings that will conform with higher capital requirements than any other bank in Europe or the rest of the world. That means they're less competitive because they cannot lend so much and they cannot fuel the economy as much as their competition from overseas. And that's where the damage to shareholder value will come in.
Yes, I take your point there that it does seem that the banks are being squeezed on both sides. They're being told to be more conservative, hold more capital, but at the same time lend more. They can't do both, can they?
No, and the issue is that by lending too much and leveraging their balance sheets far too much, they got into huge trouble. But then, again, one of the things I keep coming back to when discussing the Vickers report, which says to ring fence the banks, is that the banks got into the biggest trouble were actually retail banks. They didn't have any investment banks, Northern Rock, Halifax Bank of Scotland. These rules do not address that issue about how the banks originally got into trouble, and that's because they took too much capital out of the balance sheet, they leveraged themselves too much. Now it's pulling it the other way, and it's actually creating a schizophrenia almost to say the banks can't lend, they need to reserve capital, but then they can't compete because other banks will come in. It's a mess.
Yes, but you can see what the banks are up to here, can't you? In the end, what they would like is for themselves to have all the upside of a high-risk model and the taxpayers to have all the downside. Well, that's where we were. We don't want to be there again.
No, and that's where the UK government's taken a lead to try and show that we can sort out the issues and effectively try to come up with a new bank framework that resets the system, in the words of Mr Osborne today. And Europe has bought into some of that. I mean, the European regulators are talking about ring fencing too, but the Americans, for example, has just said that banks cannot gamble their own money, which means that they get into trouble with the money on their own balance sheet and potentially therefore the taxpayers' money. They can only actually manage other people's money. We've gone a step further than that, and that's where right now the question is, does that allow us to be competitive? Will the banks still be viewed as a good investment vehicle for shareholders, going back to your original question?
Isn't there a non sequitur here in the bank's line that, oh, well, if you make us less risky, it will make it harder for us to raise capital. Well, surely investors don't want a high-risk model into which they can pour their money. They want something safe and sound.
Now, they don't want a high-risk model, but banks make profit by lending and by getting people to take money on high interest, both businesses and obviously individual consumers. That's where they overstretched themselves in terms of lending too much during the last decade, and the subprime crisis where everyone talks about the guy in Alabama in a caravan suddenly buying a mansion is the sort of thing that gives you the picture of how they got into trouble. That's the high risk model, but actually it wasn't that the banks did that stupidly. They were doing it because they had flawed models for their investment banking operations, and it's the risk management more than anything else that needs to be addressed, and that right now has actually been an undertone, but not an explicit area that's been addressed by the regulator, the governments, or even the banks themselves. The risk management approach to the total integration of the retail, commercial, investment bank model is the bit that I think is still untapped.
All right, Chris Skinner, many thanks for your time. We appreciate it. Well, of course, most of us just want banks to keep our cash safely and lend us money when we need it. Today, the leading accountancy group, Ernst & Young, predicted that lending to businesses and households will start to expand this year for the first time since the credit crunch. Well, I'm joined here in the Gherkin by Carl